This is Victoria's Chinatown. As children, we came down every summer from Prince George, in northern BC, to visit my Aunt Susie at her shop, which my grandfather, Willie Nipp, started in the 1890s as a dry goods store. I remember peeking into the window. There was always something different to see and touch. When Aunt Susie died in 1981, the entire shop was sold. But packed away in the cellar was this trunk, where it sat for decades, silently cradling chapters of an untold story. Inside were faces I'd never seen before. Each photograph captured a moment of history, and I wanted to know more. Through the stories of my 2 aunts and 5 other women across the country, I went on a journey into the past, catching a glimpse along the way of the lives of early Chinese women in Canada. Most of the early Chinese who came to Canada were from Guangdong province in southern China. There, most people were farmers, and for generations, women watched their menfolk go overseas, selling goods or selling their labor to places like the Philippines, Peru, and Jamaica. Women stayed behind to care for the family. A woman's role was to be a dutiful daughter, wife, and mother. Her destiny rested in the hands of the men of the family. By the 1850s, southern China was ravaged by war, drought, and famine. To feed their families, the men fled across the ocean. Canada first enticed them with mountains of gold. Then came the chance to work on the Canadian Pacific Railway. From 1881 to 1884, 15,000 Chinese laborers, including my grandfather, bent their backs while dreaming of going home as rich men. Old-timers say that 4 Chinese died for each mile of track. Meanwhile, the women of the village counted the days, waiting for some word and a few hard-earned dollars. Some never heard from their men again. A few women sailed across the Pacific Ocean on the instructions of their husband's family. We don't know much about the early Chinese women who arrived in Canada, but the first official record was in the British Colonist in 1860, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Kwong Lee with 2 children, sailing from San Francisco to join her merchant husband. Although the pioneer Chinese women are no longer with us, we can still share in their experiences and hear their stories through the voices of their Canadian-born daughters and granddaughters.
My grandmother was born in Canton, China in 1864. I think she landed in Victoria and ultimately moved to Yale, BC, and her husband had migrated to Canada in 1880, and I think he was about 35 at that time, and he was brought over as a laborer for the CPR. He lived in Yale, and when they got married, we do have a little record from a newspaper in Yale that records their wedding ceremony, and it was quite a do, I guess, for the residents of the small town of Yale. And they lived there and had subsequently had 6 children. My mother was the second eldest. She was one of 3 girls, and there were 3 boys in the family.
I don't know a great deal about my grandmother, but what I do know is that she came to Canada to marry my grandfather when she was 17. And she was accompanied by sort of a maid companion. And my grandparents were married in 1893. They lived in Montreal and had 6 children. The second born was my mother, Avis.
This is my grandmother, Eng Shi. Her name simply means that she came from the Eng clan. No one used her real name. She arrived in Victoria in the 1890s to marry my grandfather, Willie Nipp. My grandmother had 10 children. My Aunt Mabel is her 3rd daughter.
I never heard her complain. Back then, Chinese women believed that it was their destiny to endure hardship. Children were more obedient in those days, so they didn't need much looking after. My father bought the groceries and my mother did the cooking. Women didn't do the shopping.
My Aunt Gladys is the baby of the family, and she's still called a Bi. In Chinese, I call her Bi Gu. My grandmother passed away when Aunt Gladys was little.
I don't remember too much of her except that she had a bun, and she's quite tall, and outside of that, I forgot to tell you that they almost gave me away when I was a baby. She just had too many babies to contend with, I guess. However, it was your dad that prevented from giving me away. Being the youngest in the family, the brothers and sisters looked after me, and I was old enough then to dress myself. All I couldn't do was cook and do housework. So my sisters and brothers kept together, and we stayed together as a family.
My grandmother died at the age of 32 when my mother was 11, so that my mother acted as sort of like a little mother to her siblings. All the children moved to Quebec City, and I think that my grandfather at the time was sort of moving back and forth between Quebec City and Montreal. I don't believe that my mother went much beyond elementary school, but there were people in Quebec City at the time who became very interested in this cute little Chinese girl who was smart, and eager to learn. So the church people were very good to her.
My grandmother, she quite realized she was going to live the rest of her days in Canada, and she hired a tutor for the family from Vancouver to teach the children how to speak English and to read and write. But my mother, by virtue of being the helper for her family, she was sort of the custodian of her younger siblings, and so my mother was not allowed to participate in those lessons. Actually, she didn't have much of a childhood because she was put in this position of responsibility at an early age.
And then the children, like we are, the girls don't go to the English school. They just go to the Chinese school, because he said the girls have to go back to China eventually, so no sense to learn English. So I didn't go to English school until they have the separation, school separation, the Chinese from the white children.
Aunt Mabel was the first daughter to attend public school. I did know that my oldest aunt, Kay, and my second aunt, Susie, were only educated at Chinese school. I also did know that my grandparents had a young girl from China as the family's helper.
The Chinese who came over here, like my father, a lot were merchants. They sent for Chinese girls as if they were their adopted daughters, so that the girls could come here. Therefore, a lot of families then had maids. We had too. Because every family had a lot of children, the maids were like servants.
In traditional China, poor families were forced to sell their daughters into service. They were called muizai. The family that bought her was responsible for her care until she was married. But when the responsibility broke down, some girls were traded. Others were forced into an arranged marriage. Many were mistreated.
They were not allowed to eat at the table with the family. I don't know whether they had to eat leftovers or what, but our maids ate with us. And our parents told us to address them as big sisters. It was not like other people.
Girls who weren't so fortunate could only take refuge in a shelter established by the Methodists. A home was set up in 1883 to rescue prostitutes and runaway muizai. By the turn of the century, the home became the Oriental Home and School for orphans and widows. In addition to receiving a good Christian education, the missionaries also helped many residents to find suitable husbands.
My father was something in 20 or 21 years older than my mother. And we feel he must have been in his early 20s when he arrived as a laborer for the CPR in Yale. And he married my mother in 1908. So my mother was 19, and we feel he must have been close to 40 at the time he married her.
He came over, not too much education, again, from the village, speaking Toisan. And he worked very hard, started out as working as a houseboy, learned to speak English, and so he became quite fluent to the point where he acted as interpreter, the court interpreter. Then later on, he became a insurance agent for the Sun Life Company. My mother was about 16 when she married my father, who was 28 at the time. So there was a big difference in age there. They were very unusual at the time, not to have been an arranged marriage.
When it came to getting married, a woman was expected to follow tradition. Few even dared to dream of other options.
If you didn't marry, how were you going to make a living? So most women got married.
If my Aunt Susie had been born in China, she would have married. In Canada, she chose a career and supported herself.
My sister was a teacher, so people respected her. But if you didn't even have a job, people would say, she must be no good, no one wanted her. That's how people used to think. Just like back home in the villages, most women got married.
But countless married women in China lived apart from their husbands. The Canadian government made it difficult for a Chinese man to enter Canada, let alone to bring a wife and children. Except for merchants, diplomats, scholars, and missionaries, all Chinese had to pay a head tax, which rose from $50 in 1885 to $500 in 1904.
At that time, no Chinese women were seen here in Montreal or in Canada, or very few Chinese women were allowed to come into the country. But by the time my father became a merchant, he was able to send for a wife. He was allowed to bring his wife over. My mother came in 1913, and she was quite young. She was only about 24 years old.
When my mother came, I guess possibly must have been very hard for her, because there weren't very many wives here at that time. There were mostly single people here. My father was a coal miner later, after being a laborer, and so most of the families they brought over worked in the coal mines. And so my mother, I guess she lives in that street where all the people go to work. The men go to work every day, to the coal mines, and she stayed home and raised a big family.
The role of the Chinese woman in those days was that you got married, you went into your future husband's home, and you were expected to bear his children, to make a life with him, to cook for him, to look after him, to look after his children. And this was expected, whether you wanted to or not. You didn't know whether you were going to marry a rich man or a poor man, but whatever your lot was, that was your lot. And I think one of the early stories I told you was childbirth, that my mother always managed to have the children in the early hours in the morning, because in this way it wouldn't disturb her usual function of serving the hot cereal at 6 o'clock to the rest of the family. In 12 of the 13 births, my father was the midwife who helped deliver the children. She said that through all her pregnancies, she didn't miss out on a hot breakfast for the rest of the children. And I think that's a very remarkable feat. Yes, I was the eldest of 8 children. My father, being traditionally Chinese and wanting a lot of boys, thinking that boys are much better than girls, really. I mean, this is the way Chinese people used to think. There were eventually 4 boys and 4 girls, so we were evenly divided. I think my father was terribly happy. My mother did do a little bit of crying, though, at first, because first 3 girls came before a boy came. And that was very, very important to her, that she must do the right thing by her husband by giving him a son to carry the family name.
And my father always say that she goes down the railroad tracks there and picks up a baby and brings it home. And this is what we believe, that he went down there and picked up the baby and brought it home. And we never knew that mother was ever pregnant because, you know, I'm number 6 in the family, so she's gone through 5 pregnancies before me. And I also remember her wearing this Chinese dress with a big apron always and the pants. And we never realized that she was carrying a baby or if she's big.
Most families at that time were large. Families which settled in the cities usually lived in small quarters, above stores in Chinatown. They were crowded into tight apartments which had few amenities. Behind these windows, women raised their children and helped their husbands. But no matter where they lived, there was a feeling of isolation. Women longed for shared laughter, familiar food and sounds, anything that reminded them of China.
And she has a very favorite thing that she does. She has some Chinese records that she has in the home, and it's a gramophone. And I always remember it's got a dog on it, and it's got a great big horn on it. You know, I think every big home in those days had those gramophones. And she would sit there and listen to her Chinese music, and Father would be clearing away the dishes and getting us off to bed. And I think that was a quiet evening.
My Mother's Day was very, very busy, but because, you know, with 8 children, there was plenty for one person to do. And besides cooking and washing in those days was not washing by machine, you know, you had to wash by hand on a washboard. You really scrub those clothes. So with 8 children to look after, to cook for, to sew and clean for, that was a big day.
And every weekend on Saturdays or Friday nights, the Indians would come there and hitch their horses and their buggies to the trees inside this little bushed area. My mother would go down with the largest reed basket that she could find, and through the use of her Chinook and through the fact that she seemed to be a genuine, happy person and a helpful person, sometimes I think she would even bring some of the clothes that no longer fitted us. And with 50 cents in exchange, the Indians would fill up her reed basket, just cramming full with the landlocked salmon, which we call kokanee. And this was subsidizing the family budget.
I never saw my mother go visit people. In those days, we lived upstairs. She would stick her head out of the window, and the neighbor would stick her head out, and they would chat a little with each other. And that was it. I never saw her go next door to visit.
I think it wasn't till the mid-1930s that she saw the main street of Vernon for the very first time. She heard about where the stores were, she knew where the groceries and the meat markets were, but had no idea where they were because she was actively parenting all those years, her first 20 years in Vernon.
Sometimes when she was really down, she would ask me to go for a walk with her. We didn't even take the bus. We would walk to Beacon Hill Park.
I
went with her, and on the way we would buy some pastries. We would sit on a rock to take a rest. But we had to check the time because she had to go home to cook supper. We went once in a while, not often, only when she was really down.
My grandmother used to say that if there was a bridge to China, she would walk back. In Canada, the pioneer woman learned to cope on her own, and at the end of the day, she fulfilled her obligations as a wife and mother. But as a woman, so much more was expected of her.
My father died in 1911 when I was 2 years old. My older sister, Alice, she came running to Mother and says, "Daddy's acting funny." And he says, "How come?" he's acting funny. When mother went to him, he was already dead. He died of a heart attack.
Yes, my father passed away in 1937 after an illness, and my mother was left with, well, practically destitute, with 8 children to look after and no means of support, no way in which she could earn a living. So, you know, I really admire her for this. I wish I could emulate her, because here was a woman who did not speak English, who did not have any education and how to run a business. She took over the reins of that little restaurant with the help of my sister.
I think my uncle provided money for the passage to go to China, and it was, we traveled steerage in the Empress of Russia, and we went to school in China.
It was Agnes's mother's plan to educate her children in China after she was widowed. But as a second wife, she didn't get a fair share of her husband's land. She settled 5 children in the best school she could afford and returned with 3 children to North Bay, Ontario to start again. The family pulled together and eventually opened a small restaurant.
When we were going to school, we had very little time for ourselves. We had to come home at noon hour, and while we were serving, we eat a sandwich in between time. Then we rushed back to school.
She felt that whatever my father owed at his death it was her duty to repay the people that the money was owed to. She was quite devastated that there was one merchant she couldn't repay simply because he had moved away, but she was able to pay every cent that my father owed.
My mother said during the Depression years, she really would have qualified for welfare or whatever it was called at the time, but she was too proud to accept it. She felt that she had a hand, she had a head on her shoulders. She would make do with what she had. And I think in art, even growing up in Vernon, I can't think of any existing social service agencies we use or the people in our Chinese community use. We were just not destined, but we decided we would be self-sufficient, and comfort was found within the family.
I can remember many, many meals, particularly dinners, when my father would be home. And, you know, then the rule was, okay, we all speak Chinese, you know. And so, of course, we'd all clam up because it would be much easier not to say anything than try to struggle and say something in Chinese.
Chinese school was held, say, about 4 o'clock, right after our public school ended. And we'd have lots of fun there, but I mean, it was just, we didn't think that it was any great deal. You know, we were expected to learn Chinese, and we did.
As time went by, she really felt she was at quite disadvantaged by not getting the same education as her younger brothers and sisters. So through her own children, she really, really pressed on. She knew there was a public school system, but she really, really encouraged us to attend school. I remember also when I was in grade 5, we had to bring an exercise mat to school of some type. And my mother simply found a whole lot of old little baby crib blankets that we had, and she sewed them up in such a way that it looked quite decorative. She had sort of a little blanket stitch on the edge, and my mat became the envy of the class because it was sort of worked on. It had that creative look, whereas everyone else had a run-of-the-mill store-bought mat.
We were a novelty. As far as I can remember, we didn't suffer from any kind of discrimination or prejudice. School was just accepted as any other child. As a matter of fact, I think that, you know, they gave us special attention because we were a novelty.
But it wasn't the same on the West Coast. From 1907 to 1922, several school boards in British Columbia fought to keep the Chinese in segregated schools.
But I always felt that it was a poor school. You know, there was a school that was way off our way. We had to walk a long, long ways to school. When we passed a regular school to go to that school, so it didn't seem quite fair as a child. You know, why aren't I allowed to go to this school? I don't have to go to the other school. But I don't think our parents said anything about it at all. And then I think maybe deep down my father's feeling is that hopefully one day we'll get a good education. One of us will.
When the school board in Victoria segregated Chinese students into what the Chinese called the chicken coop, parents joined together to take legal action and enrolled their children into the community-funded Chinese school. But for many, segregated schools are very much a part of childhood memories.
This little girl went to school with a dirty dress on, and this teacher picked her out and stood her in front of the class. And not only she did that, she took me up there because I was clean. You know, I used to get scrubbed behind my ears before I go to school. And she compared her to me. So I felt very, very bad for her then. In those days, it was bad enough to be discriminated upon, to be sent to that school, well, never mind taking her up to class. And maybe those were the times that I felt a little bit in my childhood that, you know, I shouldn't have been born Chinese. Maybe I should have been born something else, that I wouldn't have to be treated this way.
One of my best friends told me, Ida Hill, she told me later on, you know, this was in high school, and she says, you know, Emma, when I first met you, I was really afraid of you. And I said, Ida, why were you afraid of me? Well, she says, you know, when I was a kid, when I was bad, my mother would say, now, if you don't behave yourself, I'm going to take you down to that Chinaman in the laundry. And this is why I was afraid of you when I first met you.
In high school, I was always well accepted and took part in all the activities and held various positions, you know, in the various teams or the class and so on. My parents had great aspirations. They are a great believer in education, and even for their daughters, which was rather unusual at that time in the Chinese family. And they always felt that girls as well as boys should be educated.
My mother, not so much, but my father believed truly that boys should have more education than girls, because boys have to make a living later on in life and support a family. When hard times came, I was the one that had to be taken out of school. I was 12 years old when I was taken out of school, so I can go to work and help support an older brother and a younger brother.
During my years at university, her Chinese neighbors would constantly say to her, you know, why would you want a daughter to go into post-secondary education? You know very well she's going to be married, and then she'll be somebody else's wife and grace someone else's household. So why are you letting her go to university? And my mother's pat answer was that I was really supporting myself, and this is what I wanted to do, and perhaps there was a place in my life for both a career and ultimately marriage.
Despite a woman's aspirations and the support of her family, before 1947, many faculties and professions, particularly in British Columbia, were closed to the Chinese. For those who wanted to study medicine or law, it meant moving out east, where opportunities were not as restricted.
My parents decided to move to the suburbs, which, as you say, was most unusual because at that time, I guess all Chinese families lived in the Chinatown area. Why did he decide to move to the suburbs? I guess because he thought we would have a better life there, and very happy memories that I have of that place.
We had quite a large backyard, and every winter my mother would flood the whole backyard with a garden hose, and we would have she converted it into a skating rink for us. And this is where we all had dreams of being Sonia Haney, and my sister Margaret got her first pair of ice skates, the fancy white ice skates, and she was the pride of the whole neighborhood. You wonder now, in a small community like Vernon, what did the children do to entertain themselves? That was always a question. We never hung out at the local Coke places, and certainly there were no malls, but we always found things to do. And it was a fun time. I don't ever remember sitting with my hands folded and say, what are we going to do next? That never happened. We always had something going, and we didn't have a whole lot of board games, and we did have a radio. Chinese New Year was a very important time for us, and we were always told the traditional Gong Hei Fat Choi approach to everybody, and in turn we got little red packages, and gosh, if we got 25 cents in a package, that was a king's ransom.
And we would save all these red packages, and eventually we'd go out and buy something at the end of the day, and it was the biggest thrill for us. Biggest thrill, imagine, to go out at the end of the day to buy an Eskimo pie that just cost 5 cents, for instance. But to us, it was something that we looked forward to.
By the 1920s and 30s, the Canadian-born generation brought a new vibrancy and spirit to community life. Strength within the community sustained their determination and confidence to deal with the realities of being Chinese in Canada. Activities and events brought people together and generated excitement. In Victoria, the community lined the streets when the basketball team came home as the 1932 Island champions. My father, Philip, was on the team. In Eastern Canada, many Chinese families were Christians, and they were active members of their church. The church in turn provided them with social services and support.
Church always played a very large part in our life, and my parents were more or less the pillars of the Chinese United Church. My mother was often invited to sing at various church occasions.
There were Chinese school picnics, and Mr. Harry Lui Poi, he would go out early on that day to stake out this particular place. We used to have all kinds of races, and every year people look forward to it, and we always had a good turnout.
But parades and picnics could not chase away the stigma of being labeled a second-class citizen in one's own country.
In the government, there wasn't one Chinese working there. You couldn't vote because you were not a citizen. You couldn't even apply to become one. For the higher level jobs, they would not hire Chinese. There were restrictions on travel. If you left the country, you had to return after a limited period of time. In politics, how could Chinese people be interested when they were not allowed to participate? Chinese were looked down upon. Just like the swimming pool, Crystal Gardens, back then they would not allow Chinese to swim there. So there was no freedom, no enjoyment. You might as well earn your money and return to China. There you could do as you like. That's how it was.
I think the West Coast, there are a lot more Chinese, much more so than in the East. And also they settled there a lot earlier too, so that they were not really a novelty, they were a threat because of their numbers. And because of this threat, you know, they received much harsher treatment, I think, from the people who were already settled there.
On July 1st, 1923, Dominion Day, the Canadian government introduced the Chinese Exclusion Act. It affected every Chinese household across the country and every woman left behind in China. The Chinese called it the Day of Humiliation. The act stopped all Chinese immigration into Canada and kept families an ocean apart.
You work alone outside. Don't be lazy at work. Don't be wasteful. Don't take to drinking, nor gambling. When you receive this letter, write home soon. By the way, the family is short of money. Send more money home if you can. Words can hardly describe my love for you, my son. Love, Mother, Chun-Si.
Within a decade, 10,000 people, 1/4 of the Chinese population in Canada, returned to China. For those who remained, many never saw their families again.
Men were not able to bring their families over. This made a very lonesome life for them. They would treat us so well because they think of their own families back in China, their families whom they couldn't bring over. And yet here were these kids, kids who might or could be the same age as their own children or whatever. And so we were, well, as the French would say, gâtés, we were very spoiled. They missed their own children. And so they gave us their love that they would have given to their own children had they been here.
Married men lived like bachelors. Single men had no hope of marrying, but they all longed for the comforts of a family. Some men lost themselves through gambling or prostitution. Fantan Alley, with its hotels, tea houses, and gambling tables, was barred to children. But it was still part of the landscape of growing up in Victoria's Chinatown.
I think it's 541 Fiskar Street. And on the second floor, there was gambling in those days. Well, gambling is always illegal, so therefore it was illegal then too. And I remember there's always a doorman sitting on the first flight of stairs. He is the one who lets you in because you may be a stool pigeon or something. I remember one police raid, there were secret passages. Some came into our house and my father would lead them to somewhere so they wouldn't get arrested and go into the paddy wagon.
Back then there were prostitutes, yes, but later they were not allowed. In those days, there were so few women, and also the younger women were going to China to get married. The men were hungry for women. Yes, there were still prostitutes in the 1930s. In those days, business took place in people's homes. If you knew where they were, you would go there. It's not like today, out on the streets swiveling their hips like that. It was not like that at all.
I love going down to the camp, the coal mine there, to watch him go to work. But it gave me a lot of insight on what these men do in Nanaimo, with the miners, especially the coal miners. They lead a very lonely life. Most of them live down there. They don't have a home. 12, 14, 15 people in one big room, and all they have is a cot and a little table in between them. They live there, and they eat there, and they work down there. And I can see why my father was so set on helping his fellow man to bring their family over like he has himself.
And because in Montreal there were so few families, I guess in the vicinity of about 25 or 30 families here, we knew each other very well, and we hardly went out with the boys of our age. We knew, maybe because we knew them too well, and we treated them more like brothers.
I think that my parents were very open in their thinking, very broad-minded. The only thing that they didn't approve of was the girls dating, non-Chinese boys. So I never did go out with non-Chinese.
When I started to date, my parents were very old-fashioned. I remember going to a movie. My mother would be standing at the door at 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night, waiting for me to come home. It was the most embarrassing thing.
My mother, being Canadian-born, certainly was very Western in her thinking, yet at the same time, she was also respected Chinese traditions and culture. I can't say that I was confided in her. I mean, she wasn't a friend as they are these days. I think now one stresses a friendship, I'm a friend, she's my best friend. Well, she wasn't my best friend. She was my mother. And I loved her and I respected her. But the same as my father, too. He wasn't a pal. He was our father.
I was 16 years old when my father told me that there was a job in Toronto for me to come to work for my sister. So I left home then. And my mother wanted me to take my sister with me. She was 8 years old. And my mother said that, you take Dorothy with you. Be one mouth less to feed. That's how hard times were then. So I brought her in with me. And she became a babysitter for my married sister with the children. And I went to work in the store.
Within the next 2 years, while continuing to send money home, Jean and her cousin started their own grocery store. Dating and marriage were just not on Jean's mind.
I was almost 19, and she said, Jean, I think you should start thinking of getting married. You know, that's the first thing she said to me. Instead of, I didn't have any idea. So she asked if I had any friend. I said, well, I have lots of friends. She said, well, someone that you're serious. I said, nope. But anyway, so she and my father went down to Chinatown, and I also remember her coming back and saying to me, she says, this man said, well, he's a very nice boy, very quiet, but he's also in the fruit business. So in the Chinese way, that's that if we're in a grocery store, we should match somebody off that's in the grocery store so we can be of help to one another. To them, this is what marriage is all about, eh? I met him, and after a while, my mother said that if you like him, you know, that's it. So we got engaged and then planned to get married. We had a beautiful church wedding, and I think anyone was invited.
Canadian-born Chinese women, like Jean and my Aunt Mabel, lost their citizenship when they married men from China.
When I went on my honeymoon, our 3 friends opened a grocery store. As soon as I returned, I had to work. I had never worked in the grocery business before, but they relied on my English, so I managed the store. I did it for 30 years.
I didn't go to work because my husband, although he's Canadian-born, was a little old-fashioned, and he thought that the woman's place was in the home. So it wasn't until she finished high school and was going to university that I finally went out to work, and I did that on a dare, you know. We were having a little group in, our neighbors and so on, and the subject came to about women working, and my husband said, oh, nobody will hire her, you know. So it was on that dare that the next day I looked in the Montreal Star for the classifieds, and I picked 3 companies, and I went for interview, and the 3rd company hired me.
So I helped my father open a business, and then I opened 2 stores. One is called Wong's Produce on Yonge and Heath, and the other one out in the Danforth. So we opened 2 stores so all the kids can have a job to work, eh? And meantime, I said I won't have any children until after I finish supporting my brother. I had 6 children there above the fruit store, and I nursed the children up and down those steps. You know, I lived on the 3rd floor every day. I go up and feed them. And in those days, you can leave your baby outside in the front. You know, we put a little rope around the carriage and tie them up onto one of those poles. And that's how we raise our children.
In 1941, Canada and China became allies in the Pacific War.
In those days, everyone was emotionally charged. There was a lot of anger towards the Japanese.
We were a bunch of kids from the Chinese school, and we were against people wearing silk stockings because silk stockings came from Japan, and we were at war with Japan. So if we see anybody wearing silk stockings, we would make fun of that person or follow that person and say not obscene things, but rude things to this person and to embarrass her, you know.
Chinese women of every generation threw themselves into the war effort.
Everyone felt the need to do something for one's country. And, you know, our mothers who all these years have stayed indoors looking after their families and so on, they answered the call also. They came out to do things that they never did in their life. Coming out, standing on the street corners, holding these little boxes of tags and selling tags to strangers, absolutely strangers. And whether they spoke English or not, they just buy a tag, you know, say it in Chinese or say it in English. They did whatever they had to help the war effort. So I think I'm very proud of them.
We had a lot of fundraising events, like the big rice bowl event. There was this big container and people would throw money into it. For bazaars, we sold refreshments. People also donated items to sell. A lot of non-Chinese came to the afternoon tea events. We raised money and sent it to China. We also bought an ambulance from the funds raised from selling tags.
Then we would put on these parades where we'd get all dressed up. We'd be paraded, you know, through the streets. And then in front of us or behind us, there would be a group of people holding a huge, huge Chinese flag. And then people would throw money into this. This took place all over Canada and probably in the States too. A fair amount of money was collected.
The Chinese community in Canada contributed $15 million through selling war bonds, mortgaging their buildings, and organizing fundraisers. Canada would not conscript the Chinese, but 400 volunteered anyway. Two years after the war ended, in 1947, the Chinese were given the right to vote. The Exclusion Act was repealed, but there were still restrictions on family reunification, so there were more battles to be fought.
From 1947 to 55, 56, I guess, they were lobbying, but they weren't able to get into Ottawa for their hearing, and it took them up to 1956, I guess, or to 1957 during the Diefenbaker Day to get across country, right across country, to appeal this change, to make it more lenient and for the family to come over to Canada. And I think I got involved by chance. They were all ready to go to Ottawa. Mr. Roland Missioner, who was the MP at that time that made the arrangement, he said, listen, he said, the Minister of Immigration is a woman, and she's Ellen Fairclough. And if it means anything for you at all, you should let Jean go. And at that time, the Chinese people is very man, like it's the man does it all, you know. The woman have to walk back a few steps, you know, that type of a thing. So she said, even if Jean came along, she sat there like a dumbbell, not say a word, it'll help. So they let me go. Being only one woman there, they sat me next to Mr. Diefenbaker instead of way back in the back, where I was supposed to sit quietly in the back. And we didn't know at the time that Mr. Diefenbaker had one good ear and the ear that he couldn't hear very well. So when Mr. Wong spoke to him, he could understand, and he said, what did he say? And he asked me, you know. Everything was turned to me then after. Nobody had a chance to speak. Every time Mr. Diefenbaker wanted to say something, he spoke to me instead. So later on became a hero. And I was made the unofficial spokesperson for the Chinese people for Ontario. And it was through that meeting that we got some changes, some big changes.
As a result of their efforts, women started to arrive, and the community slowly began to flourish. The contributions and accomplishments of the older generation were officially acknowledged through Jean Lum, the first Chinese Canadian to receive the Order of Canada.
The older people have gone, and so that's why when I wear my Order of Canada, it's for the older people. They're the one that I work for, and they're the one that gave it to me.
There is no question that the stories of these women helped to fill in a missing chapter of Canadian history. But more importantly, they allowed me to visit the past. From them, I learned that the women who came before were more than just somebody's wife, mother, sister, or daughter. The pioneer women from China set the foundation for all those who came after. As in the Chinese saying, they planted the trees so we could enjoy the shade.